Everybody. I was talking to the grad students earlier. I was saying, yeah, it's really funny how I met Shannon. It was at a brewery in Riverhead. The students said, well, we feel like a lot of the faculty end up there. And I said, well, you're not totally wrong. So I was talking with Shannon, though. It was a really nice moment where I got to find out a lot about her background in research, and it was just outstanding. And in part because of that, we were able to bring her on as an adjunct in sustainability teaching one of Dr. Cochran's classes. So Dr. Shannon Curley is an avian ecologist whose research explores how range shifts and changes in migration patterns affect bird community structure. She received her BS in zoology from SUNY Oswego, her MS in wildlife biology from East Stroudsburg University, and her PhD in biology from the CUNY Grad Center, which we were just talking about how that works. She most recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in collaboration with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, where she used weather surveillance radar to study offshore bird migration and its implications for dynamic conservation strategies related to offshore wind development. Check.
Mic on?
Okay, mic on, please. Flipper is right there.
All right, thank you. Can we hear me in the back? Yes. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me today. Thank you, David, for the warm welcome. Yes, since grad school, when you start going to breweries, I guess suppose doesn't end as you move on in your career. However, today I'm going to talk a little bit about research that I've done at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but also give us a little more background about avian ecology in general. So this is work that I've done with Dr. Andrew Farnsworth, Timothy White from Boehm, Judy Shimon-Boranis from the University of Amsterdam, and then my postdoc advisor, Adrian Doctor, who it's kind of funny, he's Doctor. When I did my master's, I was working for Dr. Master. So just kind of funny how that works out. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, and this is mainly for me, so I don't meander during the talk, because sometimes I tend to do that. The way the structure is going to be is I'm going to introduce us a little bit about bird migration in case we're a little unfamiliar, and some of those challenges that come associated with studying nocturnal bird migration, but also our human impacts on these migration patterns. But then I'm also going to show how using weather radar, believe it or not, we see the forecast on TV for weather, but you can actually filter out the weather and isolate biology. And it makes it a really great tool to study biological occurrences in the atmosphere. And the research I'm going to present is a study comparing terrestrial and adjacent offshore habitats based on these weather radars. And we do these types of comparisons because we know relatively little about offshore migration, but we know a lot more about terrestrial migration. So if we can get an idea of what the differences are in these baselines, we can try to hone in on what would be the most effective conservation strategies for offshore migration. And if I get time, because I tend to ramble a little bit, I want to talk about how we've just expanded this research with the Canadian government, and that's brand new, but we're finding some really interesting patterns at higher latitudes. Let's see if this will play. So in North America, we have around 650 species of birds that breed here. And of those 650 species, about half of them are migratory. And 80% of these birds are migrating at night. So what you're seeing here is this beautiful image that a friend of mine, a colleague at the Cornell, put together, doing some pretty cool modeling about looking at individual tracks of migratory birds. And you can see it's quite the spectacle, and it's occurring above our heads, and it's something we can't even see. But we know this involves hundreds of millions of birds migrating the offshore, and actually billions of birds during the course of the season. So now we just have a selected group of species here that we're modeling. But you can also see within here, we're seeing a lot of artificial night at light. And that's something I want to get into a little bit more. Now, before I get into our effects on migratory patterns, I've been studying avian migration, nocturnal avian migration for 15 years. But it wasn't until 2023 where I got a lunar fancy schmancy camera from Zeiss, thank you Zeiss Optics, to do a little bit of research. And for me, this was seeing this occur for the first time ever visually and not on radar was a really just enlightening moment for me. So this was at Queens. I was at Jamaica Bay, right outside of JFK Airport. And this is in 2023. See the flag. So this camera's pointed straight up, and what you're seeing, what looks like snowflakes falling, are actually birds moving from north to southwest direction. So they're popping off the coastline here in southern Long Island, and they're moving across the sky. So I just thought this was amazing because I figured they would be moving close knit groups, they would be all close together, more structure. But what you're seeing are these like random snowflakes in the wind just flying down. There's a little bit of an artifact that we're seeing. That want to play again? I'm going to use my mouse if that's okay to move the video forward. So what you're seeing is a little bit of an artifact. I think that's because I'm right outside of JFK Airport. So at some point you're going to see an airplane maybe come through. I think I skipped too far ahead. But yeah, this I thought was very neat. You're seeing all these birds at different altitudes, at different speeds, just calmly moving through the air. Very neat for me. I could watch videos all day. Everything looks different every day. But we know as humans, anytime we modify a habitat, we do have this potential to impact wildlife. So in the in the millions of years in the evolution of avian migration, it's only been a short amount of time where birds have had to encounter human obstacles, things like artificial light at night, buildings, infrastructure, telephone poles, energy production. This is all a very new thing for birds to encounter. And what you're seeing here is the 9/11 tribute of light. Maybe some of us are familiar, had the opportunity to go and see it, but it's an art installation that is in remembrance of 9/11 attacks. And as a daughter of a 9/11 firefighter, I really am moved that I get to participate in monitoring birds at this installation. So what happens is birds get trapped or disoriented, but they're attracted to light, the same kind of way moths are attracted to light. And they get stuck in these high intensity beams. And you can see from the previous slide where the birds are moving all calmly and steadily. Now they are very much frantic. There's a lot of flight calls. This is a very stressful situation as they get disoriented in these beams. And what happens, imagine being a 12-gram bird that's migrating from Canada to South America, wasting a lot of energy in something like this is a life or death situation for these birds. So what we do with New York City Bird Alliance is we monitor the birds in the beams. And when there's too many birds like this, we ask the production crew, can you please shut these beams down? And what happens when we do that? Within a matter of about 50 seconds, the sky clears. Those birds are now ready to go back on track to begin their migration again. So this is one way, and maybe this is a bit of an extreme way, to show that when we know something more about birds or about wildlife in general, we can find ways to mitigate our impacts, whether it's turning down lights, curtailing wind farms. So I just wanted to show this as a bit of an example of why these mitigation strategies are important. But there's a lot of challenges in studying nocturnal migration. So as you can see visually, unless you have a fancy camera, visual observations are really nearly impossible. And things like moonlight, cloud cover, weather, the interaction of those can make a detection of birds pretty much obscure. I like this little image here because one of the ways we have historically studied nocturnal bird migration is by counting the passage over a full moon. So you put a telescope up and you point it right at a full moon, you can actually count the number of birds passing by. But you can imagine that that's not the easiest thing to do, and it's a very local type of study. And we know that migration occurs on these really big, as you saw in the first movie video, these really big continental scales. And things like tools that we do have at our disposal sometimes, radio telemetry, GPS, they require a lot of infrastructure. They require a lot of funding, and as you can imagine, funding in biology, as some of us may have experienced, isn't always the easiest thing. But also you have to have the knowledge and the data processing skills to use this data. So consequently, this temporal resolution in the way we study nocturnal bird migration is pretty inconsistent, and it's really hard to standardize these methods across regions and across timescales. But as it turns out, weather radar does a really nice job of detecting bird migration. So I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see a weather radar. This is NextRad weather radar. This is what they use, this network of 160 or so across the United States. And when you're watching TV, you see a weather forecast, that data is coming from this network of weather radars. They are dual polarized radars, meaning that that wave that comes out, that pulse, is also extending vertically and also horizontally. So it allows us to get a more complete picture of the shape of the objects that we're picking up on the radar. This makes it great for studying bird migration as well. So these radars are operated by the National Weather Service, the FAA, and in some cases there are these weather radars on Air Force bases. So this is what bird migration looks like on radar. It looks like a plume. You can see some precipitation here. That's signature of precipitation. So these more darker colors. What you're seeing here is the energy being returned from when a radar beam hits targets and comes back. We call this reflectivity or reflectivity factor. And birds kind of show up looking like a bloom. And this is because right after sunset, birds start entering, they take off from off the ground, they start entering the air column. And this usually happens right after sunset, which is local sunset, which is why you see this east to west fashion of these blooms occurring. In a lot of our radar studies, we do use, we only go out 35 kilometers or so from the radar to pick up bird detections. And I'll explain a little bit more why in the future. But I thought this was very neat when I saw this, when these papers really started coming out in the 2010s. I was just fascinated. And I said, this is what I want to do. And I was fortunate enough to get involved with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I pestered them a lot for a postdoc because I really wanted to work with radar. And the team was really lovely. And they developed what is called Birdcast. Has anybody ever used Birdcast before? Okay. Yes. Hi. So Birdcast is a group of scientists that collaborated together with the Cornell Lab, Colorado State, University of Mass, and growing. And it's a network of scientists that want to not only forecast migration, but also make it publicly accessible so that not only can bird enthusiasts use this as a tool, but also as a conservation tool as well. So we are a group of scientists that specialize in aeroecology. Aeroecology is the study of basically biologic activity occurring in the atmosphere. And we want to know if we can make these real-time predictions of birds. And what you're seeing is a prediction map for 2023. And that was our first billion bird night. I remember we were all really excited. In the several years of Birdcast up and running, this is the largest migration up until then that we had seen. So we like to do real-time predictions of birds. We try to treat it like a weather forecast. We predict it like a weather forecast. We can look a couple days out. And we aim to engage bird watchers, researchers, and conservationists because we want to know not only about the bird migration patterns, but also timing. Maybe some of us have heard of the Lights Out program, where there's organizations, usually run by the Audubon societies, where we ask buildings and people in their private homes to dim their lights when there's high migration predicted over their heads. And now that we're getting these longer and longer term data sets, we can now start looking at the impacts of how climate or anthropogenic change is affecting these bird migration patterns. So these are our Birdcast migration tools. And I pulled up the forecast from last night. And you can see we were predicted, can you see the cursor? Perfect. We were predicted to have a high migration night. And you can see the forecast for the next 2 days, but I want to show you what this looks like. So here's the home page, and we can actually search and get some specific details about an area. So before I pull up the page, we saw that there was a high migration night. Does anyone want to take a guess about how many birds? I don't know the answer to this yet, because I haven't checked, so I'm not cheating. How many birds have migrated last night over Suffolk County? And if you already checked the Birdcast forecast, you can't answer. Anyone, a wild guess?
2 million.
2 million. You might be pretty close. A little less than 1 million. But that was a good guess. I mean, it's still new here. So it's kind of what we say like a high to medium high migration night. It wasn't our biggest migration night of the season, but yeah, you can also see, well, so I went out with my fancy thermal imaging camera because I was like, well, it's really windy. I don't know if I necessarily believe that this is going to be a high migration night. And I was like, whoa, there's actually quite a bit of birds, but they were flying quite low, is what I had in mind. So you can see with the birdcast migration tools, you can look at the bird migration activity over the course of the night. You can get flight direction and speed. And yeah, you could see they were a little low when I was looking for in terms of altitude. So we have all these cool stats that people can look at just from using radar data. And then you can also look at these migration pulses over the season. We know migration doesn't occur consistently throughout the season. It occurs in these pulses. And then we can look at the average over time of how many birds cross. So a lot of neat things that we can do with these radar studies. So sorry, that was a little bit of a detour there, but I wanted to show you. And what we're learning from these radar studies, and this was a study by my postdoc advisor, is that these seasonal migratory movements make up of billions of birds. So you can see if you take a transect line over the southern United States and northern United States, what we see in the spring is we have 3.5 estimations over the years of birds moving up, and then 2.8 moving up into Canada in the spring, and then we see more birds moving down in the fall. That's because birds go to the northern United States and Canada, they breed, they reproduce, there's a lot more young birds that are migrating south. So, and they also follow what's called a loop migration pattern. Broadly, geographically speaking, we see a lot more birds migrating up the center of the United States into North America and Canada. And then in the fall, they take a more eastward route. So they're kind of following this clockwise kind of pattern here. But as so much as I showed you so far, we're only looking at what's happening over land. And BOEM said, well, we want to know what's happening. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management said, well, we want to know what's happening over the water as we start thinking about these areas where we're going to consider developing offshore wind. And we know that oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surfaces. But I already mentioned the issues and the challenges of studying nocturnal bird migration. Imagine doing this over water. So now we're in more remote areas. And these are the areas that we're going to be talking about today. They're not easily accessible, and even if they are, getting a boat is not an easy thing to do as well. And there's also very limited infrastructure out as there is. So we know very little about what's happening offshore, especially at night. But I can tell you from friends, I haven't actually been able to get myself on one of these boats, is that birds regularly land offshore on these boats. These are all photos that my friend Allison Black took. She works for NOAA. She does a lot of monitoring there. And it's a real big diversity of birds. And these aren't just birds that are blown off course. This is a regular occurrence that we see. So things like Louisiana water thrush and Blackburnian warbler and Rula, black-throated blue bay-breasted. Not a warbler is the white-throated sparrow, and I just thought it was really cute and I wanted to add that picture in. But let's go back when I showed us the images of the 9/11 tribute. So this isn't a phenomenon where the birds get disoriented by light just over land. What we are finding is this also happens over water. So this is a video that was taken, I guess I have to manually press it. So this is a video that was taken off of a NOAA ship that was doing research. They had their deck lights on, but this is in August of 2020 in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. And what we're seeing are these birds getting attracted to the ship lights, mainly Kentucky warbler, yellow warblers, winged warblers in there. But you can see that they're stressing out. And instead of moving, they encountered a headwind from a convection storm, is what we think happened. And instead of moving to safer locations, they ended up circling the boat for hours and hours. And unfortunately, and this is hearsay, I did not speak to this person, but it was a mass mortality event. We call this a fallout, where disposing of these birds involved sweeping the deck of the ship itself. Yeah, so it's a very intense thing. So we know, and it's not just, and this is a research vessel. We have cruise ships, we have freight containers, we have an extensive infrastructure of offshore oil and gas. We have flaring. These are all things that can impact, and we have such little information about it. And imagine trying to monitor. I just put this up because one of my colleagues just designed it, and I thought it was beautiful. You can see kind of the radar reflectivity here. But you can see that, imagine if birds are interacting with these, what I'm going to call, these are rotors on a wind turbine. They fall right into the ocean. There's no way to count mortality of these birds. And a lot of times they wind up as fish food or in the bellies of sharks when we have mortality events like this. So there's a lot of challenges in studying these migration patterns. But, well, I should say up until recently, offshore wind was predicted to expand in the USA significantly over the next decades. And it's a little bit of a pause on that, but that doesn't mean that this won't happen in the future. And these areas where there's optimal wind conditions, we don't know if this is optimal habitat for wildlife, and if you can see them together, but we just don't know because these movements are so understudied. But we know that for birds that migrate at night, this can be particularly hazardous, especially if visibility is very low. So we want to know when, where, and how many birds are flying, and at low altitudes. And when I say low altitudes today, I'm talking about below 300 meters. Essentially, let's go back. Essentially, the rotor swept zones, that the typical height of a rotor swept zone for offshore wind. And as I mentioned, we wanted to look at these differences. What's happening terrestrially versus adjacently offshore, to help us parse out what the differences are, to help us develop better strategies. By highlighting those differences, we can get a better idea of what will be most effective in terms of targeting dynamic conservation. So meaning conservation that is adaptable in a quick amount of time and in different locations. Things like curtailment, so shutting down the wind turbines over a period of time. And we also think the more data that we can get, forecasting and these near real-time forecasting alerts, like you can find on the Birdcast website, can be used in real time. And I'll explain at the end how we're already implementing this. And for offshore wind, you want to keep those wind turbines running continuously, right? You want to generate as much energy as you possibly can. So if offshore migration occurs in shorter periods and on fewer nights, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing for both the birds and a good thing for offshore wind as well. So our study looked at these 16 NexRad radars, so our 16 weather radars. So I just want to point this map out. So these are all coastal radars within 40 kilometers of a coastline. And for the rest of the talk that you see in gold, I'm going to talk about the Western Gulf of Mexico. I know I'm trying to say Gulf of America, but I've been saying Gulf of Mexico daily for 4 years, so forgive me. And this is how it is in the paper. We have our 3 Eastern Gulf of Mexico radars. We have our 5 Mid-Atlantic radars and our 4 North Atlantic radars. And they all have these different 4-letter abbreviations that we refer to for each one of the radars. And we looked at 5 different metrics, and I'm going to walk through them slowly because I know some of these bird metrics, radar metrics are going to be new to us. So I want to make sure that we know, and at least I know what I'm talking about here. So we looked at 5 different metrics. The first one is differences in migration traffic or patterns. And this is essentially saying, remember how I said we can get energy back, we can measure energy from reflectivity that's back from when we hit targets. We can convert this to a density. And if we assume a constant radar cross section, with birds, it's 11 centimeters squared. And if we know something, and that's the average size of a migratory bird, we can get an idea, if we know direction and speed, the number of birds crossing a 1 kilometer transect line. So the reporting that I'm going to do is for this passage is going to be birds per, essentially passage birds per kilometer. But think about it this way, a kilometer is not very long, right? You probably walked more than that going from your car to the building. Or I hope not, but it's possible, depending on if you can find parking. So If you extrapolate this out, this number becomes enormous. So that's the first metric that we're looking at. And the other is the effect of a coastline. So think about birds migrating north to south. Let's generalize the migratory direction here. And if birds have an equal proportion, if we find that there's an equal proportion of birds on land and on water, and this, let's say this vertical line is a coastline, we can assume that birds are what I like to say called hugging the coastline. They're maybe essentially using the coastline to help navigate. So think about birds traveling down the eastern seaboard along the Atlantic coast. But then we can have birds that could, the coastline is going to be perpendicular to their movement. So again, the birds are moving north to south, but the coastline is running east to west. When we see increased proportions of birds below that line, that's how we know, and that's where we assume that birds are making these big offshore crosses. So think about the Gulf of Mexico with a more east to west coastline. But also we want to know how long is the migration season. That's really important, especially when you want to think about curtailment and such for wind farms. So when we look at differences in duration, we're going to call the full migration period is when passage goes from, we have 5% of our passage from the season to 95% of the passage of our season. And we're simply looking at the number of consecutive days within that window that these migration bouts are occurring. But then we also want to look at when's the peak migration period occurring? When are we going to see the most birds and where? And so here we're looking at between the 25 and 75 percentile of migrationists. So you're going to hear me say the 90% and 50% passage for each one of these metrics. Does that make sense? 90% being the full season, 50% being that peak sweet spot of the most bird migration. And this is just an example here because you can imagine these are moving windows. These change radar by radar. But as I showed in the earlier slide showing the birdcast stuff, we know that migration doesn't occur consistently throughout the season. When weather conditions are right, we see these spikes in migration. We see these big bouts of migration, and we can also do the same metric. When do we see, how many nights does it take to see that full season migration passage? How many nights occurred during those consecutive days? Were there big migratory events? Versus where's the 50% of that passage over time? So some big, when are the first big migratory movements and most important? So does that make sense? So we have what's occurring over the course of the season, how many peak nights do we have versus how many were they really strong nights to get us to that. And then lastly, and probably most intuitively, is we want to know these differences in altitude. Do we see differences in birds over land versus birds flying over water? Because if we find that birds are flying lower over water, that tells us something more and gives us more information about what we need to do in terms of things like mitigation for our offshore anthropogenic activities. And I think something that surprises a lot of people, before I continue on with this slide, is the bulk of bird migration occurs under a kilometer of the ground. We see a lot of bird migration on a quiet night, in a quiet place. If you sit there and you listen long enough, you will hear these migratory birds doing flight calls above your head. And it's hard to pick up, but it's also hard to believe that these migratory birds are flying so low. And we can use our radars to look at this. So for this study, we had 16 radar stations from 2014 to 2023. So those are the 16 I showed you before. This was our NextRad, which stands for Next Generation Radars, our dual pole radars. And what's great about this data is it's open access. It's a massive data set. But you can go in and if anyone's interested after, I can show you the software. You can go in and look at these radar images yourself. And the first thing we had to do to address some of these challenges here is we had to create these spatial masks. We had to take this raw data, what's called a polar volume. And this is a full azimuthal scan of a NextRad radar at all different elevations. And we needed to parse it out between over land and over water. So we had, for every polar volume, we had to take two. One that was isolated over land and one that was isolated over water. Now, I think I mentioned earlier, from these polar volumes, right now we can get an idea, we can convert reflectivity to a density. We can get all these heights and get density on what you have here is on the x-axis, you have our volume density, on the y-axis, we have height. And what I want to point out here is for birds, there's really not, density is very low at higher altitudes, but as we get closer to the ground, we see this big increase. It's kind of like this arc-shaped curve. For our polar volumes in typical bird studies, we typically calculate what we call our standard vertical profile or a standard polar volume that only extends 35 kilometers out from the radar. And this is because as a radar beam extends away from the radar itself, and because of the curvature of the Earth, I'm hoping none of us are flat earthers in here. So, okay, so you believe me. Okay, so what happens is that beam, not only are we dealing with a beam that can potentially overshoot microreactivity, that beam geometry also changes. The beam width and height get wider, and it makes bird estimations harder. But I decided to make my life difficult and not stick with this standard profile. But we did download them, and I'll explain why in a minute. I said, well, a lot of our radars, we get more radars if we can extend this out to 75 kilometers. We can get more information about bird density offshore when some of our radars are a little bit more inshore. So we calculated 2 more vertical profiles looking like this. So for every radar scan, we get something like this, over land and over water. And this is something neat. I do want to plug that my postdoc advisor did develop this wonderful R package that is very user-friendly if anybody's interested in learning more about radar. And this was all done in the work that he's done, making radar data, these really massive data sets, more accessible. So as I said, I'm glad none of us are flat earthers. I just want to show here. So here's our radar station. Here's the beam moving away from the radar. But what happens is as you move farther away from the radar, you start overshooting activity. Now I said a lot of bird activity happens pretty low, right? So by me saying, I want to go out 75 kilometers, do this, well, we start overshooting migration activity. This only happens over water. When we're on land, we don't get this phenomenon. So think about water going this way, land this way. When we go up 75 kilometers, we don't miss bird activity really low. This only happens over water. So what's happening in this slide is, remember the vertical profiles I showed you before where bird density is just becomes higher at lower altitudes? Well, if you string them all together, if I string all those polar volumes together over time from a radar, we get what's called a vertical profile time series. So this is a couple hours over the course of the night. And what you're seeing in the cool colors is really heavy bird migration. And as it gets higher to the altitude, you can see that migration is kind of petering off. Well, look what I did. I'm now missing the densities below 300 meters at this particular radar. But based on this, we don't think that birds are just not migrating below 3,000 meters, right? They don't just stop at this line and be like, nope, not gonna cross it. So we had to solve a problem. I had to solve a problem. It was not an easy problem. I needed to figure out what the density below 300 meters was by developing a machine learning altitude extrapolation model that takes what we know from the top of these strung together vertical profiles to what's happening below. Does that make sense? Yes. Sorry, I know it can get a little daunting with a lot of new terminology. So as it turns out, we can do that. It took a long time. It took a long time to figure out. So some of these radars were missing some of these altitude widths, up to 400 meters in some cases. And what we did is we trained a machine learning model from the upper portions of what we know about the vertical profiles to predict what's happening below. We did this by a cube root transform. It makes the data a little bit cleaner and a little bit easier to train. And we normalize the shape of the vertical profiles by dividing by the mean of the total vertical profiles. I don't want to get too much into the weeds because I want to make sure we're good on time, but I'm more than happy to discuss the specifics on it now itself. I remember how I said we had a standard vertical profile, ones that only go out to 35 kilometers. So we trained our model on 700,000 vertical profiles, so individual vertical profiles, assuming and tested them on the terrestrial vertical profiles, which weren't missing. These weren't missing the data. But we had to assume here that the shapes of the vertical profiles are the same offshore. So that was a big assumption in our model. But we use XGBoost, that is a supervised machine learning model. It's super fast, it's super fun to tinker with. And our basic model was we're taking our density of the missing altitude bins and providing what we know, or using what we know from the above. So as you can see here, we were able to fill in these gaps. So we see that there's a lot more activity occurring below 300 meters. And in fact, in this example itself, in just this course of 6 hours of time, 300,000 birds would be missed if we didn't make this correction. And this is just one radar on one night. So this was an absolutely necessary and tedious step, but it's going to be very useful, I think, for moving forward. But so that example was 300,000 birds, but you can see how that adds up over the course of a week. So we really need to fill in these densities to get better estimates of these birds. So moving on to the results, there's quite a bit, but I want to just highlight some of the bigger patterns here. Is we do see what you're seeing in light gray is our terrestrial migration passage. Remember these numbers of birds that cross that transect. And in dark gray, we have what's happening offshore. And what you're seeing with the bigger dashed line is the mean across all of the radars and season. And then the dotted line is the mean for offshore in that season across all the radars. And we have our spring and we have our fall. And there's a few distinct patterns. I know this takes a little bit to look at. I had to look at this for so much time to try to make sense and wrap my head around it. But we do see that, well, the first obvious thing is there's less offshore migration occurring in the spring than there is in the fall. Okay, well, that's intuitive. I had mentioned that birds come up and breed here on the northern latitudes. They migrate down. We're going to have more birds. But it's a little bit more than that, because we also see, if we look at going from west to east and north, that there's also a lot of variation, not just at each radar between seasons, but also between each radar. Even radars that are close geographically linked are showing different patterns. But one of the major patterns is in the spring, we see this bigger push of offshore migration in the western Gulf of Mexico. And then in the fall, we see that there's still quite a bit, but we're seeing more of a shift to what you're seeing here is the eastern Gulf of Mexico. So that kind of fits in line with the loop migration patterns that I was mentioning. But we also see some, and a lot of times what I thought was really neat looking at this data was that there's a lot of cases where in the fall we could have more offshore migration at a radar than it saw terrestrially in the spring. So we're talking about a substantial amount of birds. And I won't talk about every radar as much as I'm sure you want to hear about every single radar individually. I will highlight just a few. So one is our Western Gulf of Mexico Corpus Christi radar. And that radar sees the most offshore migration traffic in both seasons. So that tells us there that that's an important part for migratory birds in terms of where you're going to place wind farms, where you're going to place any infrastructure, to be honest. So that tells us that's an important part of their migratory pathways. We also have this weird radar on the Atlantic coast. This is our Jacksonville radar. Also sees quite a bit of migration traffic in both seasons, but also what's interesting is some of the highest terrestrial migration in the fall. And we still don't know why this is, why this Jacksonville radar is such a hub for birds, but all of us are like chomping at the bit to get down there with portable radars and try to figure out what is going on in Jacksonville. So I just want to point out that wonky radar on the East Coast. What I find to be the most interesting radar is this KEVX radar. This is in Tallahassee, and really not much happening offshore or terrestrially in the spring. But in the fall, this radar has the highest offshore migration activity of all the radars, which is telling us that this is also an important area to think about. And also tells us birds are probably jumping off the coast right here in the Eastern Gulf. So it allows us to highlight some of these big changes by looking at these differences in passage. And lastly, let's just give the East Coast a little bit more credit here. We have two radars, KTLX and KMHX. There's almost nothing happening in the spring at all. And I remember when I first started parsing through this data, I was like, oh, these radars pretty boring. But as it turns out, they're the ones that make the most substantial jump in migration activity. And there's also quite a bit of offshore wind planning going on in this area as well. So not only do we get an area that's important, so maybe in the spring we don't see a lot of birds, but in the fall we see this substantial jump, especially over wind planning areas that are existing over there. So I just wanted to highlight, how am I doing on time? Ooh, I'm getting not great. So but what we also see here is this positive relationship in fall to coastline oriented. But meaning we're seeing a higher proportion of birds, the more perpendicular a coastline goes to the migration traffic, so birds moving north or south. And what you're seeing here in these gray bars is showing us that we're also seeing an increase in proportion of offshore migration activity, despite the migration pattern itself. So very interesting seeing that we're also seeing among the radars this increase in passage. And also these increases, I know I have to move a little more quickly here, but also these increases in passage in terms of each radar itself below 300 meters is what you're looking at. So I won't go through all the numbers here, but if we talk about birds per kilometer, and we take these numbers and we extrapolate them out, that becomes millions and millions of birds, hundreds of millions of birds migrating below 300 meters in the offshore environment. But also we find that the duration, those numbers of consecutive days, are not nearly as long, or are not as long offshore as they are terrestrially. And in the spring, that's what you're seeing in this column here, the black line being that 90% passage, these dark columns offshore and terrestrial being that sweet spot, that 50% passage. You can see that offshore, there are shorter periods for the full duration of migration, but also the peak migration duration, just by a little bit. But we're also, I would take that with a grain of salt because we're lumping in all these radars all at once. We can see that there's quite a bit of variation in that timing among each radar itself. So in the fall, we also see the same thing, where we see offshore and offshore duration is always going to be shorter, or is always shorter in both the 90% and the 50% piles in terms of those consecutive number of days, sometimes as much as almost a week. That's really important information for wind farm people investing in wind farms. Is can we have a shorter time of curtailment? And lastly, this method graph.
Again, I'm sorry, that's, I'm surprised by that. So you're saying that in the fall, there's a shorter period of time for migration?
For the offshore habitat,
Offshore.
yes.
Huh.
Yeah. Despite there being more birds, right?
Right.
Yeah, and that leads perfectly into this, because the migration also occurs on fewer peak nights, is what we're finding. Yeah, so fewer, and this is always the case. So you can see the average lines here with the data being terrestrial, the data being offshore and the dash being terrestrial. And just, these are different, the y-axes here, just remember these are the number of nights that we're looking at here. So you're gonna see the bigger differences on fewer number of nights. But yeah, there's fewer peak nights in both the spring. We see quite a bit of difference between these number of peak nights. And also in the fall, between our 90% and 50%. And that's what you're looking at here with these violet plots. So this is also really important information. So not only is the season shorter in the offshore environment, it's occurring on fewer peak nights, which is really good news if you are an investor in offshore wind. And lastly, we do find that, and this is pretty interesting as well, is that flight altitudes are also lower in the offshore environment, as much as, depending on the radar, 13 to 20% lower. So what you're seeing is these, on the y-axis here, these flight altitudes for each one of the radars. And while we didn't see a difference between seasons in terms of flight altitudes in general, we did find that we do find lower migratory activity at lower altitudes offshore.
Maybe like
30 more minutes?
Yeah.
I'm getting there. I get excited about talking about this. So we don't need to go too much into the summary then. We know that these flights are predictable events. We're learning so much more from our radar studies. We know that they're occurring on fewer peak nights and over a shorter period of time. And that they're also occurring at lower altitudes. We have a bunch of information now from this 10 years of data And what we're doing now is implementing it into real-time conservation measures. We're starting to develop, which we're trying to extend the offshore model into what you saw earlier, into birdcast. We're identifying high-risk, high-use areas for offshore wind. And we are now advising in different capacities how we can communicate in terms of dynamic conservation, things like when is curtailment important. We can actually reach out now to people invested in this and tell them what we think in terms of different areas and where infrastructure is going to be built. And we hope to use this data. I hope to get out with a portable bird radar. They're like $100,000 though, so I don't know if that's going to happen. But we want to get these finer scale radars out over the water to get better resolution for this data as well. Now that we know this timing of high risk, high use areas. This is being used on some pilot cruise ships in terms of they go into bird mode. That means shutting down all of their windows, shutting blinds on all their windows and shutting down the deck lights when we think that bird migration is going to occur. This is part of a toolkit that's been developed by a bunch of us colleagues and led by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's being used. That's an example of a prototype for our forecasting, but since I'm low on time, I want to show one more thing. We've expanded this into Canada, which the data is not yet open access, so this was a lot of trouble getting it to us. But I want to show one quick thing. So here we're just looking at, so here we are, here's where the study is. And I'm going to point out one radar and one neat thing. Because remember when I said we have peak migration about 3 hours after sunset? Well, as it turns out, at higher latitudes, movements are a little different, and we're seeing densities peak twice in 1 week. I'm just going to show you what that looks like. So what you're looking at here is birds taking off from the ground, and they're moving. And then if you give it a little bit of time, what we're seeing is up in the corner here, more birds moving in from over the water, and they're aggregating on the coastlines here. And that's why we're seeing the double peaks. And that's something we don't see with our terrestrial radars in the US. So I got through it. Sorry, I knew it was going to run a little bit long, but yeah, I'm happy. I just want to thank Ben Bondor and Kyle Horton and Raphael Nosfermer and Elliot for putting up with me for the last couple of years with all my questions. Excellent air ecologist. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. We have 2 grad students who signed up to ask some questions today. So Samantha and Huron.
Thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. My question is, you mentioned that birds like start to take off for migration like around sunset. So how do events like the solar eclipse, although it's like rare and it's short, and like even like dense wildfire smoke from like that kind of like darkens the sky, how does that impact their migration back?
That is such a great question. And we actually got the last solar eclipse that we had, it wasn't peak migration, and they are a bit disturbed by it. They do start taking off, and we see this signature on the radar itself. And it's not even just migratory birds, and birds in general, when it got dark, started getting stirred up. And yeah, you do see that signature. So when you see, and then as soon as it starts lighting up again, they dissipate from the radar. So that's, yeah, it's really neat. There's a nice study that came out about 4 years ago with the Lab of Ornithology that looked at this, and yeah, they do respond. Wildfire smoke is a little bit harder to study. That's something that we are working on at the lab, and that's because the particulates in the air makes it a little more difficult to parse out this biological activity when you have a lot of smoke and such also. But we do know that there is some disturbance there as well. That's an awesome question.
I was just wondering if the length of migration seasons and also like the number of peak nights, if that's been changing with climate change, and if you guys have been able to look at that at all.
We don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually don't know. We only have for the dual pole radar. So remember how we have the radar beams going up and down? Before 2013, while the data set extends longer, we don't have that dual polarization. It makes standardizing that data over the course of 10 years a little more challenging. So we're still not quite there yet on these longish term data sets. We're working on it to kind of standardize between the two so that we can extend this longer into time. So we actually don't know. And I think that's a fantastic way to move forward. Yeah.
So you mentioned wanting to improve resolution of offshore data. Has there been any proposals or ideas to put next generation radars on either the wind turbines themselves or the control stations or even offshore stations?
So not so much the next rad radars. I don't know if you can. Not so much the next rad radars. There is one, like you can't really call offshore. We have one in Puerto Rico, one in the Keys. Those are really good radars that we want to look at. These portable marine radars are very, very expensive. So upwards of $100,000. And so unfortunately, we don't have a lot of access to this. And this is something that we are, like I said, chomping at the bit to be able to do. What we are considering and what BOEM has been considering is putting up bioacoustic monitors, so following flight calls. Now, not all birds call, so do miss a lot. But also there's a possibility for thermal imaging and these smaller tools that have finer scale resolution to help us improve on especially the forecasting. Because as you can see, there's quite a bit happening offshore. So yeah, we're working on it. We just need the money, right?
Yes, my question.
Hi,
Hi.
great talk and really wonderful this is happening. When I was living in Sweden in the late 1970s, and they were using military radar
Mhm.
then. And to focus on these types of problems. I'm
Yeah.
sure they're still doing it today. Bad chance of getting American military radar, I guess, but
Yeah.
the reason I raise it is that their focus was on species. In other words, there were specific species they worried about, like raptors and so on, so
Yeah.
on. They were not interested in general bird populations. That was my memory of
Yeah.
up at Ulstrad and others who were doing this
Yep.
work. And I'm wondering if there's any focus that you have on birds of concern that are endangered.
Yes.
I don't know, gannets and raptors, other types of birds that are in decline or in low population numbers. That and I think the reason why the Swedes were able to do this is that the migration was very focused. It might be like 2
Yeah.
weeks. That 90% of the birds
Yep.
come through.
Yep.
So have you been thinking about doing that sort of thing of looking at specific species?
So terrestrially, that's already happened. Well, it's already happened.
Yeah, I'm talking about the marine bird.
But the marine birds, so there's a lot of species that we know. So originally with the portable radars, that's where we got, that's where we started learning more about blackpoll warbler migration, their migrations from the northeast to Bermuda. And our radar, you're right, does not pick up species composition, which is such a bummer. It can tell us that there's birds there, but that's as far as we know. But looking just at the species from the slide that my friend sent me a picture of, while those birds are protected under the Migratory Species Treaty Act. So there is opportunity here to work within these conservation measures that we put in place on land, but we don't yet have them offshore. So yeah, great question.
I just want to kind of amplify that there are seabirds who are always on the ocean.
Yes.
And a lot of these installations are being built or planned in some foraging hotspots. Some
For sure.
European studies show that a lot of seabirds don't recognize those places as the ocean, and they will avoid them, which means a gigantic withdrawal of their foraging
Yeah.
habitat.
That's correct. And thank you. You emailed me.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm less familiar with diurnal foraging activity, but Juliet Lamb from Nature Conservancy has a lot of nice papers out showing that seabirds, there's some seabirds that are completely deterred by these installations, right? They're that optimal foraging habitat for them is no longer an area where they're going to go. And conversely, gulls, some types of herring gulls and such are preferring to feed in these areas because of the different food types that are being introduced by
Because they
these.
land on the structure,
Mhm.
cormorants.
Yep. So it's kind of a dynamic problem. So we're seeing different things for different species at different times of the day. Yeah.
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk. Ecology is the word basically today, but a couple of questions. When birds migrate,
Until they get back.
do they migrate? We must know where they're going. Are they zooming straight? I mean, I used to keep hungry pigeons as a boy.
Yeah.
I take them to Boy Scout camp. I fly around the circle out and it's zoom. Off they go.
Yeah.
That's one question. But the other is these radar beams are extremely powerful. I mean, probably millions of times more powerful than the cell towers we see around the neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether the beams themselves have some effect on the animals, on the birds, that maybe affecting their migration or affecting their brains even.
Oh. Okay, first question. We're learning that these birds are flying very indirect, they kind of are meandering, right, as they go along, so they'll have maybe a set direction that they're going. But kind of like how we're walking, going, they're also seems like they're meandering as well. But with purpose. And sometimes birds are blown off course by rough weather and such, and that disrupts their movements. But it seems to be like more of a consistent pace, but not just a straight line. The second question is, I have no idea. I really don't, I cannot answer that question.
I mean, the emphasis is that birds are going to be killed by rotating elephant, right?
Yes,
I don't know whether these real powerful radars.
if they would have
They
impact,
might attract birds, just like the bright lights.
yeah. Yeah, that I don't know, that is a very good question that I cannot answer. Naomi,
How are you able to distinguish between like birds in the radars versus something like bats, where they look very similar? I just wanted to ask how you're able to tell the difference and or if you are at all.
so bats typically they're less frequent on radar. They occur less, they fly a little bit lower altitudes, they give a different signature on the radar, and we do filter out different things, so there can be contamination, we call it contamination of insects and bats, they're not contaminants, they are wonderful, but but they do, we do get a mix, and I'm not gonna say that, now these are estimates off of the average size of a bird. That's not to say that we don't have other things mixing in, but they behave very differently on radar as well. We see different flight patterns where bats, when they come up into the sky, they do a roosting pattern, they do like a circular pattern. Insects are very isolated and local in a lot of their movements. So it's really hard to tell, and it also to what is a bias in the data set as well is not every bird is going to be 11 centimeters in cross section. So these are average estimates over time, so we do our best.
Thank you.
You know, it's a great question.
I have a question. I may have missed this, but do you only operate the radars when they're in clear air mode? You do precipitation as well?
Yep.
I assume you don't take any data when there's strange happening?
We filter it out. So remember how I mentioned we have the radars are dual polarized?
Right, you're looking for like correlation coefficient.
That's exactly it. So correlation coefficient, and what is meant by that is how similar is something vertically as to it is horizontally. So things like precipitation tend to be more circular. They get a value closer to 1. Birds, they're not, they're like this in the radar. Those values drop usually below 0.6, 0.4. So we filter out the precipitation. And we also have a machine learning algorithm called MistNet that takes those patterns that like what you see, it's trained on weather, and masks out those pixels that are weather. So we use 2 different things to filter it out.
Do the same thing with other radar, like weird things like secondary ghost spikes and other secondary echoes and things like that, right?
They show up really, really wonky on the radar.
Yeah.
Like really, really wonky. And yeah, we have different, in fact, we just had to write for the Canadian radars, we're writing a new way to filter this out because they get really crazy storms in the late, even in the late spring, but also in the fall as well. So we try our best again. Still an evolving field. Michael?
Do you know the true rate of scattered cross-sectional areas for most of the bird species? Like how much of an assumption is it? Like, is it a pretty good assumption, or does the range of those vast scattered cross-section areas vary?
So that data is there and it is available, but I am not the one who crunched the numbers. So I can't really answer that, but yeah, there is quite a bit of variation. So this is a pretty standard number that's used both here in the US and in Europe, but I just used that information that was given to me to study.
I have one question. Okay, you make the question, you call me.
Very.
I'm interested in, like, you talked about how, the risk to birds associated with this offshore wind turbine installation and, possible extensions of, you know, non-ocean policies for species in general. Have you talked to any operators or developers that would be open, or is there open to, setting up, I guess, procedural things that would be protective of migratory species, or is there awareness of those things? Is there any risk perception about that? Like how hard is it going to be to work with developers?
I really think it depends on the developer. We've really only been in touch with one, and since then, I think a lot of that has fallen through. Unfortunately, with the change in administration and the changes in the different priorities. So those that are interested seem barely interested in wanting to do this, especially when you think about building green. We want this to be green, truly green energy. We've gotten, I can't really mention the company or anything, but there seems to be people who are vested in wanting to do the right thing and to be able to mitigate the impacts before even establishing these wind farms themselves. And this is something that's already occurring in Europe and in the North Sea. A lot of these wind farm operators are already curtailing and putting in these measures. So since we have such a limited infrastructure here, let's just hope people want to do the right thing and build this here.
Connected to Mary's question, you mentioned that you developed a toolkit for cruise lines and how to mitigate some of their impacts on migratory birds.
Yes.
Have any cruise line operators adopted that toolkit?
They are. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention it yet, because it's such a pilot program, Viking Cruises. Is already interested in working with starting to introduce bird mode, where it's putting down the blinds, and there's a colleague at US Fish and Wildlife Services, Joanna, that is actively reaching out to more of the commercial cruise lines. And it's all about seeing, and this is a bigger collaborative effort. It's not just about the timing of birds. Cruise ships have to think about the types of lighting that they have on their ships and what that lighting needs and how can they change it to make it more effective. It's a very initially costly kind of undertaking. But again, cruise liners, they don't want their employees out at 3, 4, or 5 in the morning sweeping birds off the deck, and this does happen. So there is an interest here in turning what could be the hustle and bustle of a cruise line and turning in the top deck into more of a sky, stargazing type of experience. So there's some mixed, it's gonna take time. It's all very new, but yeah.
There's a question about the illumination of the turbines themselves, right? It could be an issue.
It could be.
Has there been progress made trying to ensure that the lighting that's installed on these or not?
That I can't answer. I don't know much
I
about
know
that.
with oil, let's say the Gulf of Mexico, they did some movement to try to, I guess, goes blinking red is the best, I think. Or,
Yeah, so trying to dim these really
right.
bright, these fluorescent
white
lights,
shed.
yeah. Is something that we're working on, is something that I know, for cruise ships is something they're trying to work
Or
on
at least the
as well.
turbines should have lights that are at least attractive to birds, right?
Yeah, I would agree, but I know far less about the manufacturing and the design than I do about what the birds are doing. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
That
you.
was
Thank
such a
you for
good
having me.
Q&A. Great to have.